Hello Orchid friends, how are you? Welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time watching my video, my channel is all about orchids. From what orchids I have, how I grow them, my thoughts on certain orchid topics, to what orchids in my collection are blooming, etc. So if you want to follow along my orchid hobby adventure, please consider subscribing to my channel and turn on the notification. Today in this video, we're going to look at two of my mid-sized Phalaenopsis orchid that I have purchased on separate occasions from Trader Joe's earlier this year. I just haven't made a video on them yet. So let's look at them today and see how they have bloomed and how they're doing today. So this orchid, the tag indicates that this orchid's name is Phal Royal Yellow. And I can see the yellow part, but I'm gonna tell you why I find this orchid very interesting. First of all, the color is yellow and orange and a little bit of pink. So overall, I think it just looks very cute. But another big reason why I wanted to get this orchid was because the bottom two sepals, they have kind of like a split in between where half of the sepal is red and then the other half is more yellow orange. And this is the kind of trait that some orchid species would have. For example, the Bellina would have these kind of split color sepals, or Valdacea. So I was thinking this orchid may have parents that are really close to the species. So I was guessing maybe it would be fragrant, but it's not, right? But because of all of the above reason, I decided to purchase this orchid just to see how it does, and I really think that it's a nice looking orchid. But one of the things that pretty soon you're gonna see in the photo is that the older blooms would have more red, and as the younger blooms open, we realize that the red is starting to fade, and you would see more dots, small dots or patterns throughout the whole flower. Like here, the older flowers have more solid red color, orange color in the background, but then as the newer flower develop, you don't actually see all that red pigment anymore, and it's just the yellow primarily and some dots, some patterns, some markings. And after I brought home this orchid, it did have some bud blast problem. 2 buds dropped. Those were the 2 smallest buds, typical of orchids who come to a new environment. So that's not too bad. Overall, this orchid was doing pretty good. And on one of the branches, it was just developing buds when I got it, but eventually they all bloomed, and later you're going to see as well the newer flowers are obviously smaller, but then also is not having as much red in the background. So here you can see it's just has so many little dots or markings, whatever you want to call it, but then you really don't see a whole lot of red and orange in the background of the flower anymore. So it's just that pinkish in the center, and then pretty much the whole flower is yellow. But then the bottom 2 sepals, you can still see that there is that center line going across. So overall, I think this is a good find, and even though it's not fragrant, I think it's quite nice. And so for the care that I have given this orchid when it was in bloom was basically just reverse osmosis water. I know that some people would recommend giving it some fertilizer, give orchid some fertilizer when it's in bloom, in hopes that the fertilizer will extend the flower, the flowering phase. But in my experience, I don't know that has really made a big impact of for the flower, because I only use quarter strength, and sometimes I only give a fertilizer, if I do at all, with flowering orchids, maybe once a month, every other week, once a month. So maybe that's not enough to say fertilizers do not help with orchids that are flowering in flower. But some people believe that if you don't do the fertilizer right when they're in flower, you could potentially cause the flower to fade and drop quicker than they should. By the way, I go through phases where I sometimes get very attracted to flowers with patterns, with dots, but then sometimes I get attracted to flowers with other type of characteristics. I don't know if you go through those phases as well, because for quite some time I was very fascinated with orchids with markings, with patterns, with dots. But then for some times I was really just looking for orchids with pure white or one solid color. And then for some phases I was looking for orchids that are in purple. So I have all of the above. I don't know what your experience has been for you with your orchid preferences. Share that in the comment section down below, so that I know that, you know, we all have those phases. We all go through those phases. But once again, this I believe I purchased this orchid around mid-April, right? And now it's almost end of summer. So for the upcoming segment of this video, we're gonna take a look at some of the photos of this orchid now. So how it's doing currently. Before I repotted this orchid, it was in bark chips, a mixture of bark chips and sphagnum moss. But now I have repotted it into semi-hydro, and the media is a mixture of hydrocorn and manto clay. I find the ratio to be either 1:1 or 1 part manto clay and then 2 parts hydrocorn. As you can see here, it's growing a new leaf in the middle. The leaves are all doing really well. And what I have done usually is I wait until the reservoir is completely empty and there's no more condensation that would happen. That's the indicator for me to give this orchid another watering session. And sometimes, well, most of the time in my environment, that wet to dry cycle takes about 2 weeks. I do give this orchid fertilizers now on a regular basis every other week with quarter strength fertilizer, but I'm thinking I want to do some experiment with this one to maybe up it to 50% just to see how it does. And because the color of this orchid's leaves are pretty dark, so I'm thinking I want to put it up on the very top of my growing shelf so that way it receives maximum sunlight, just to see if the leaves would lighten up in color, because right now it's in pretty dark green. And when it comes to butterfly orchid or phalaenopsis orchid, typically when they're in darker green, that means they're not getting enough sunlight. And if they're in lighter green, Granny Smith apple green, that could be, I think that's good. But then if it's like yellowish green, unless they're species orchid, otherwise they could be getting a little bit too much sunlight. So I'm thinking I want to do some experiment with the fertilizer, but then also with the light condition. And finally, as most of you probably already know, I use outer cup to avoid algae formation for my semi-hydro orchids. And this is what I do. These are 16-ounce regular cups that you can get at dollar stores or grocery stores. And so far, they have worked pretty well for me. So fingers crossed, and hopefully this orchid will give us some bloom in the next spring. And here we have the second orchid. Its name is Flushy Yellow. It is yellow, but I don't know why it's called Flushy. At first I wasn't gonna get this orchid because the pattern of the orchid, the pattern on the orchid and also the color, just not something that was impressive to me until I further inspected the plant itself. It has 2 plants in one pot. And you know, when it comes to buy one get one free deals, I'm all for that. So for $8.99, I decided that I'm gonna get it because it has 2 plants and 3 spikes. One of the spikes is actually from the keiki. So it's a mother plant and a baby plant, but this baby plant is also mature enough to throw out a spike for me. So that was kind of nice. So so when you buy orchids from grocery stores, you really have to look at a couple things in terms of how to choose an orchid. You know, either the leaves are, you know, looking really healthy, or compared to the same kind of orchid, if one has more leaves or better root system, that's the orchid you want to go for. Or more plants in one pot. And here you can see after it flowered, the flower spike browned and yellowed and dried up. So what I have done is I cut 2 of them off and only kept one of the flower spike. I still cut the 3rd one in half, but I keep that one because usually when I take this orchid out of its plastic container, right, I can just pull this flower spike and take this plant out that way by pulling the flower spike. So that way I don't have to risk of, you know, messing around with the leaves. And currently, like I said, it's still in its original bark chips and sphagnum moss media, but it's growing new leaves. Both plant, the mother plant and the baby plant, are both giving me a new leaf. I'm not going to repot this orchid until next spring. So I'm gonna, because the media looks really okay, and they're right now currently sitting on the very top of my shelf at the moment, receiving a lot of sun. So I think it's doing fine based on the leaf growth that I'm seeing, and also there are actually quite a lot of good roots in the media. Right now you can't really see that because it's all covered in, well, it's not all covered in algae, but there are some algae formation for sure, because the outer cup that I'm using is transparent, and I purposely did not use the blue one because I want to, I guess, have a test on, you know, the impact of orchids, on the impact of blue outer cups on my orchid, right? And for the ones that without the blue outer cup, yeah, they do have algae. Even though algae doesn't hurt orchid or doesn't really compete with orchid for nutrients, they definitely kind of, you know, limit your ability to be able to see your roots, your orchid roots. So that's my personal preference. I like to see roots. So when there is algae, then, you know, it's not as easy to observe root production. Overall, I'm pretty happy with this orchid, right? 2 plant for the price of 1 with 3 flower spikes. What else can I ask for, right? This is all I have for you today. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you would like to get more orchid related videos from my channel, please subscribe and turn on the notification. I want to wish you happy growing, and I will talk to you in my next video. Ciao!